All right, gentlemen, we are going to begin now taking a look at Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is really just a continuation of what we began to look at last week, specifically ecosystems and more broadly ecology. Okay, and there is at least some of the stuff we've started to actually look at and talk about in terms of the labs last week, as well as the videos, and we're just going to begin to take a look at it in more detail. So again, we have here just a list of the topics that continues here. We have your objectives. Again, this is important in terms of understanding how to answer these questions. Means that you're working through and understanding the information in the chapter on a conceptual level. And so you want to make sure that you are familiar with these and that you can answer these appropriately. Now, what we look at here, guys, the whole point here is that we can study any ecosystem from several different vantage points, several different angles. And one of the angles that we look at, and the angle that we'll spend a good bit of time talking about, at least in this slideshow, is the energy that is in an ecosystem. And ecologists recognize that most ecosystems, not all, because you have already learned, but the vast majority of ecosystems get their energy from the sun. Okay, energy from the sun enters the ecosystem, and it in particular enters the ecosystem at the point of plants. Your green plants, the ones with chlorophyll, those are the ones that are using sun energy to make sugar molecules, and from there the energy, as we will see, travels through the ecosystem. But this initial process of turning the energy, the light energy from the sun, into what we could call food energy in terms of the sugar molecules or the glucose. This is the process of photosynthesis. And this is the process that we attribute to these green plants that use chlorophyll to actually do this. Ultimately, it's a chemical reaction. And we see here that photosynthesis is defined. It's a process, it's a chemical reaction. Plants, algae, some bacteria, whatever the organism is, it has to have chlorophyll. They will use sunlight. They will use carbon dioxide and water. I'm sorry, they will use, this is a misprint here, they will use sunlight and water, and they produce carbohydrates, and they produce oxygen. Okay, and we've got to recognize what are the things in the chemical equation that are the byproducts, what are the things that the plants are actually after. We can represent the process of photosynthesis as a straight chemical equation, which you have here on the screen. A plant is going to take 6 molecules of CO2, carbon dioxide. It's going to take 6 molecules of water, H2O, and the solar energy, the energy it gets from the sun. And the chemical process then is going to yield 1 molecule of glucose, that's the C6H12O6, and 6 molecules of oxygen that are given off. Again, here the plant is interested in getting the glucose, the plant is interested in getting the carbohydrate, and the oxygen is given off as a byproduct of the process. We take these plants, which you're going to see are at the foundational level of any food web or food pyramid, and we call them producers. We call them producers because they make organic molecules from inorganic molecules. Simply put, guys, we call them producers because they make their own food. And in most ecosystems, the things that are at the producer level are going to be plants, although it's not always plants. And we'll see that in some of the more extreme locations and ecosystems that exist. We also refer to producers as autotrophs or self-feeders. Okay, of course, they make their own food. Then it makes sense that we would come up with the term self-feeders. Now we also, within an ecosystem, we also have organisms that get their energy by eating other organisms, and those are simply called consumers. They're not making their own food. By definition, this is an organism that eats other organisms or organic matter instead of producing its own nutrients or obtaining nutrients from inorganic sources. So the very, very distinct line of demarcation between something being producer and what a producer is and what the consumers are. We call the consumers heterotrophs. So plants, producers, autotrophs, self-feeders. Everything else, consumers, heterotrophs, other feeders. So we see that we have producers, and they get their energy directly from the sun. They absorb it through their leaves. We got consumers. They get their energy also from the sun, but indirectly by eating producers or other consumers. So the point here, guys, the big picture that I want you to get in these ecosystems is that the driving engine for all these ecosystems that we're discussing is the sun. Okay, everybody's getting their energy from the sun. Some organisms are getting their energy directly from the sun. These would be the plants, the producers, using the process of photosynthesis. Other organisms are getting their energy indirectly from the sun. They're eating things that either got their energy from the sun or either eating things that ate other things that got their energy from the sun. But the sun is foundational to the energy that is in these different ecosystems that we're talking about. With all that being said, you guys recognize, even on the videos that we watched last week, that there are locations, there are ecosystems out there right now that do support life that do not get sun, right? We talked about, we saw in the videos, the cave ecosystems, and the cave ecosystems do not get sun. You get into the deepest parts of the oceans where sun cannot penetrate. It was not very long ago at all, guys, that scientists basically thought that these would be places where life was not supported. You would not find life there. And yet when they went and explored these places, there was life. There was thriving life. There was thriving ecosystems. So an example would be the deep ocean communities where there are worms and there are clams and there are crabs and there are mussels and there are barnacles. These are all filter feeders. They are in complete and total darkness. There is no sun. Photosynthesis does not occur. And yet there are producers. There is a base level, trophic level, if you will, on the food web. And because there are the bacteria that the video called the extremophiles, and these would be these bacteria that make their own food from the hydrogen sulfide that's present in the water. If photosynthesis is to synthesize or to make food from light, then we could call these guys chemosynthesis, to make what they need from chemicals, and that's what's happening with these bacteria. And then what happens is these bacteria exist and they thrive because of the hydrogen sulfide, and then these other organisms come and eat the bacteria, and from that you have, again, a thriving ecosystem with several levels on the food web that do exist. So we can talk about, we've talked about these ecosystems now in terms of the energy and where the energy is at and where the energy goes, but we can also talk about that and really talk about that energy in terms of who's eating what and where they are on within the ecosystem. And this is classifying organisms by what they eat. And basically there are the producers, and then there's everything else that eats, and those are the consumers. And we can talk about herbivores, we can talk about carnivores, we can talk about omnivores, and we can talk about decomposers. Each one of those is specific. Herbivores, obviously, are going to be the consumers that eat plants. Carnivores, the ones that eat other consumers. Omnivores, the ones that eat both. And decomposers, the ones that get their nutrients from the dead, decaying organic matter. This chart goes into more detail. It is in your textbook, and it specifically lays out for you producers, what's their energy source, examples, consumers, what's their energy source, examples. And then you have the herbivores, they eat producers, cow, sheep, deer, grasshoppers, right? You've got carnivores, they eat other consumers, lions, hawks, snakes, spiders, sharks, whales. Omnivores, they eat producers and consumers. Bears, pigs, gorillas, rats, raccoons, cockroaches, some insects, humans, and then decomposers are the ones that break down organic matter from dead organisms, fungi, and bacteria in particular. This all leads to a discussion of cellular respiration, because why are we talking about this? Every organism within an ecosystem needs to have an energy source, in particular to have fuel so that their cells can do what they need to do. Okay? If you think of cells as little engines or little furnaces, they need to have energy. And your engine or your furnace gets energy through two things. It has a fuel source and it has oxygen. Well, cells need to carry out respiration, and so they need to have a fuel source and they need to have oxygen. We know where the oxygen comes from. The fuel source is the food that they eat. It allows them to do this process called cellular respiration. The body needs to be able to break down the food so that it can harvest from the food the energy that it needs so that it can do this process of respiration. We call the process of breaking down the carbohydrates, in particular the glucose that you saw in that photosynthesis chemical equation, breaking down the carbohydrates to yield energy. We call that process cellular respiration. And cellular respiration occurs inside the cells of most organisms. So now we're talking about most organisms in a typical ecosystem. They're all going out and they're eating, or they're making food. They're getting food one way or the other for themselves for a particular purpose. And that particular purpose is to be able to break that food down to get the energy that the cells need so the cells can do the things that the cells need to do. How this happens: the cell absorbs oxygen, okay, and uses it to release energy from the food, just like the internal combustion engine is going to mix air with the oxygen in the air with the gasoline in order to have the chemical reaction combustion take place in order to harvest mechanical energy out of that for movement. This is important to keep in mind, because specifically this is why we're talking about everything that we're talking about in terms of this energy and where it's going and why it's going there within an ecosystem. So we have here the actual equation for cellular respiration. And again, when we look at this equation, what we want to do is we want to be able to see what is the cell trying to get and what are the byproducts. The cell starts with glucose. That's the C6H12O6. This is a cell in an organism. It either got that glucose as a producer because it made it through the process of photosynthesis, or it got that glucose from what it's consuming, what it's eating. It adds oxygen to that, 6 molecules of oxygen, and it gets all the way over on the right energy. That is the thing that the cell is after. It needs that energy to do whatever it is that cell does. It then also gives off carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of it, and water, 6 molecules of it, as byproducts or as waste products of the process of cellular respiration. Now, when we look at this, we have to see that there is a reason why the cells are doing this process. And the cells are doing this process, at least on one level, because they need to carry out their daily life activities. And they need energy to do that. Okay? So cellular respiration helps these cells carry out their daily activities. But very often, sometimes on purpose, if you look at different animals, in particular different animals in the season and time of the year, sometimes not on purpose, if you look specifically at humans, very often there's excess energy. There's energy that is there that is not being used by the cell, and the body of the organism and the physiology of the organism has a way to store that energy. In particular, that energy is usually stored as fat or as sugar somewhere within the body. Now, as we look at all this and we talk about all this in terms of the energy within an ecosystem, the next thing we look at is how the energy moves throughout the ecosystem, because the energy is not stationary, it transfers. Okay, One organism eats another organism, and energy transfer takes place, whether that's a consumer that eats a producer or that's a consumer that eats another consumer. That energy, in one sense, the energy is moving from point A to point B. And we study and we trace this transferring of energy by looking at food chains, looking at food webs, and looking at trophic levels. This is one of the ways that we actually study ecosystems and try to have a handle on what's happening to the energy that enters into and was within that particular ecosystem that we are studying. So we're going to look at these in order from the least complex to the most complex, moving from food chains to food webs to trophic levels and food pyramids. We start with food chains. And food chain is basically a simple link-to-link sequence in which energy is transferred from one organism to the next. That happens as one organism eats another organism. This would be an example of a very simple food chain. Algae is eaten by krill. Krill is eaten by Antarctic toothfish. Antarctic toothfish are eaten by leopard seals. Leopard seals are eaten by killer whales. Marine food chain, very simple. It gives us a basic look and a basic understanding as how the energy within that ecosystem is transferred from the bottom to the top. But as an ecologist, we would look at this and we would say, this is a simple explanation, but it's too simple. It's oversimplified even for what we're looking at in this ecosystem. So what we do is we create food webs, and food webs is just a recognition that you're going to have vertical and horizontal interconnections of who's eating who within the ecosystem. Okay, there's always more than one food chain within that ecosystem, and organisms are on multiple food chains. And so food webs show the feeding relationships, the many feeding relationships that exist and are possible within the ecosystem. So here, this shows, just so here in the middle we have what we originally had. Krill eat the algae, Antarctic toothfish eat the krill, leopard seal eats the Antarctic toothfish, killer whale eats the leopard seal. But note how complex this gets. Antarctic toothfish also eat the algae, okay? And Antarctic toothfish eat small animals and one-celled organisms. Those actually eat the algae, and krill eat those. The penguin eats the krill and the algae, but the penguin can be eaten by the leopard seal and it can be eaten by the killer whale. The crab-eater seal will eat the krill, but the crab-eater seal will get eaten by the leopard seal, and it will be eaten by the killer whale. The squid will eat the Antarctic toothfish, but the Antarctic toothfish will eat the squid, and the squid will also eat the small animals and one-celled organisms, but the squid will also be eaten by the elephant seal, and the elephant seal will be eaten by the killer whale, but the killer whale will also eat the squid, and the leopard seal will also eat the squid, and so on and so forth. The point here, guys, is that in any ecosystem, this is much more complex than what we are able to show in a simple food chain. Also, I would point out here that the killer whale is the apex species in this food web, but the leopard seal actually seems to eat more things than the killer whale does. And so that's interesting to note. Who eats who in any given ecosystem is very, very complex. That takes us to a discussion of trying to understand trophic levels. And trophic levels specifically look at the energy. Every time you move a step within a food web or a food chain, there is a transfer of energy. And that is known as a trophic level. Okay? Trophic level is one of the steps in a food chain or a food pyramid. Producers, primary, secondary, tertiary consumers are all levels, and they're going to be a specific level of energy, and as a specific level of energy, they're going to be understood in ecology as a trophic level. So when we look at trophic levels, we see that each time energy is transferred, some of the energy is lost in the form of heat. This follows from our example of the car engine. Say you mix your your fuel, which is the gasoline, and your oxygen, and you burn to get some mechanical energy, some motion, but you lose, it's not 100% transfer of energy, you quote-unquote lose energy to heat, right? The engine gets hot, the muffler exhaust gets hot, so we recognize it's not a closed system. In terms of an ecosystem, it's the same thing. Okay, what this means is that as you move up through the trophic levels, there's actually less energy available to organisms at the higher trophic levels. And that's why there's less organisms up there. That's why, there's less killer whales than there are krill. Or there's less killer whales than there are leopard seals. It's not simply a function of the fact that, well, that thing is the apex species because it eats everything else. That's how we tend to think about it, right? The grizzly bear is the apex species in a particular area because it will eat everything else in that area. It's not that. There's less because there's less energy to support a number of organisms at that level. As you go up, there's always less energy. And we show this and we study this with an energy pyramid, which you guys did in one of your labs, and you actually calculated the amount of energy that existed or was lost from one to the other. This would be an example where on the bottom of this pyramid you have the grass, which has the most amount of energy, and therefore it's the widest parts at the bottom. You go up one, you have grasshoppers. There's less grasshoppers than grass because there's less energy at that next step up. And then you go up one more and there's songbirds. They eat the grasshoppers, but there's less songbirds than there are grasshoppers, again because there's less energy. And then you go up one more and there's birds of prey, there's raptor, hawk, and there's less raptors, there's less hawks than there are songbirds because there's less energy at that level. You can see in this pyramid off to the left as well, every time you go up one level you have some energy that's lost. That's the energy that's lost due to heat. So again, there's less organisms at the higher levels, not because of any other reason. It's a function of the fact that there's less energy available at those higher levels to support the numbers of organisms there. So again, as we look at this energy pyramid, we see that each layer represents one trophic level. We see that with an energy pyramid, producers are always at the base, and therefore the most amount of energy is available at the base. And as you go up, it gets smaller toward the top. Because less energy is available at the top, there's going to be less organisms of those species, those apex, quote-unquote, those apex species at the top, because there's less energy available to support them. And how does this affect an ecosystem? Well, we see that it affects the numbers at the different trophic levels because there's decreasing amounts of energy. It lays out for us, or it drives how the ecosystem is actually going to be organized. It affects the number of organisms at each level, which we've already said. And we see that it has an impact on the number of trophic levels. We do not view an ecosystem as having an infinite number of trophic levels as you go up through the top. We don't talk about tertiary and quaternary levels. There's not consumer upon consumer upon consumer, because eventually somewhere as you get higher up, there's not enough energy to support any organisms, to support any life anymore at those levels. So the number of trophic levels in any ecosystem is a limited number. It is a finite number.